Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation for the second half of the warm-ups for the current cycle of warm-up questions and answers that we are on. Before we get started, once again, please let me encourage you to open up to the correct template for the current warm-up packet cycle that we are on. And let me start off by saying here that you should be advised that we did not have a warm-up for Thursday and Friday due to Thanksgiving break. Also, technically speaking, because there was no class on Monday, there was no physical question for Monday. However, because of Wednesday's Zoom session day being cut, the question for Monday and Tuesday will essentially be shifted to Tuesday and Wednesday. You'll see what I mean right now as we progress to that slide. So please get ready to copy down the question and the answer. So for Tuesday and Wednesday, here is the question of the day for that day's lesson. What notable characteristics and cultural components comprise to form our understanding of African kingdoms? So this question is particularly important, mostly due in part to the fact that most people, when they think about African history, they know about Europe's role in creating Africa. They know about fights for independence and decolonization, but they may not know about the real Africa before colonization. And so that's what this lesson was essentially focused on. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that you might have learned from completing the lesson. From a geography standpoint, many African kingdoms began to rise and thrive at different parts in Africa's history in different locations. And the reason for that, of course, is all about geography. Obviously, it's based about where certain rivers are, mountains, areas of protection from both of the elements and, of course, from nature. These kingdoms set up camp, so to speak, in different areas of the continent. As you recall, Africa is just simply huge. So kingdoms like Egypt and Exum and Cuba and Mali would set up in different places. They also did so because of resources. Many kingdoms began to capitalize off of their understanding of natural resources that they had in the nearby area, and they began to cultivate them and grow them and trade them. And farming, of course, was incredibly important for almost every single kingdom and civilization in Africa, too. They later began to expand off of that as well. Now, additionally, trade became even more important as time went on. In fact, many kingdoms began to form expansive and elaborate trade routes and connections with other kingdoms alike, and then also over time with other European superpowers. So, for example, in this lesson, you learned about Mansa Musa and his elaborate trading system that went from North Africa to parts of Europe. Religion, of course, is also really important too, as religion would have one of the biggest roles in shaping the cultural development of certain kingdoms. So, for example, Western African kingdoms and Northern African kingdoms were heavily Islamic, and so therefore that shaped their development in a big way, whereas some kingdoms on the eastern part of Africa were shaped by Christianity, and also some kingdoms were stateless as well, so that of course affected their development. Now, the peopling of Africa during this time is quite diverse as well, as many tribes would consolidate, come together, and or fight for varying reasons with varying outcomes. Keep in mind that one of the things that's often overlooked about Africa before colonization is that there was an elaborate history of, interconnected webs of relationships between certain tribes that liked each other, certain tribes that hated each other, and that deserves more attention. Now let's look at the legacy component of this. Why does this matter? The fact is that studying African kingdoms and this era of history shows us and tells us how advanced Africa really was before colonization. I think a lot of people might say that, Africa needed Europe to colonize it to make it more advanced and compete on the world stage. However, when you take a closer look at Africa before colonization, it's pretty clear that there's a whole unique world that was already there and well established before colonization came to form. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question of the day for the latter half of the week for Thursday and Friday. So what events and factors led to a scramble for Africa in world history, and what impacts did this have on Africa specifically? So when I hear or mention this phrase to you, and when you hear it in the future about scramble for Africa, we're talking about the time period when European countries essentially scrambled for colonial holdings of Africa. Let's talk about that right now. Here's what you're going to learn in the lesson. So obviously the slave trade is one of the most important things that affects Africa and also the world in many different ways. This, of course, created an international market for human labor, which allowed for Africa to be viewed as an ideal place for this labor exploitation. Whole populations were systematically uprooted from different pockets of Africa, mainly, of course, West Africa at first, as the slave trade would rise, and then combine to form later on into the interior. So these encounters or connections between many European powers and Africa had different types of outcomes, some positive, some negative. These European powers, however, traded heavily with African kingdoms and then later on traded across the Atlantic in the triangular trade system that we'll talk about later. Imperialism was also an important reason for the scramble for Africa, as land grabbing and nation building was a priority for successful European countries. If you don't know what imperialism means, it's basically the construct or belief that your nation or group of people is superior to that of another, and so you might overtake it and overrule it and overpower it for your own benefit. So the historic Berlin Conference was called to order by Otto von Bismarck of Germany. He was the German chancellor at the time who called this conference to basically divide up the continent according to Europe's needs. And so what he did was he invited several European countries who had their eyes on Africa, so to speak, and in this way they were intrigued to divide up the continent according to their needs. So they drew boundaries and borders, and of course, no African leadership was there at the meeting to do this. Now, another key reason for the scramble for Africa was it's all about the resources, right? All about the money. Many natural resources began to accelerate both in their cultivation and production and also in their selling and profit. And so international economies began to be even more rich over time. For example, diamonds and gold and things of that nature became incredibly important for the economy. Now, you would think, once again, that most of these African countries would see the return on benefits for this. They did not, mostly because the European powers that came into those parts of the countries that had those resources often exploited the labor in the process as well. Now, legacy. Let's talk about why this matters in the grand scheme of history real quick. Why do we have to talk about the scramble for Africa? Well, this really shows us a trip point in history, if you will, where Africa is forever changed due to European influences and imperialism. The fights for decolonization would later take place, where many African countries would rise up against their former European superpower holding and try to take back their own country for themselves. With varying degrees of success, they would find this to be their next phase in the chapter of writing history. So the reason why we talk about this, once again, is just to put this in perspective, is that Africa would be forever changed. And so understanding the story about how this would happen is really key to understanding the story of Africa today. All right, so there are your questions and answers for the oral packet cycle. Once again, please make sure that you type down the question and the answer and then hit submit when you are fully finished, and you shall receive credit for your work. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you found this to be helpful. Thanks.